Alberta Premier Danielle Smith recently went on a tour of Ottawa, Toronto, and Washington, where she chatted up our economy and some investment opportunities. Now, in Washington, she met with a number of senators and congressmen. Now, to talk about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, we've seen in the past that both U.S. President Joe Biden and Donald Trump have strong protectionist policies. Do you think this trip by Premier Smith will help, especially when it comes to Alberta energy exports?
Well, one would hope. During the Kenney government's years in power, they put a lot of effort into sort of cross-border lobbying with offices in Washington and things like that. You remember that Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, who's a pretty crucial pro-energy vote in the Senate, was in Alberta for a tour. So this has been sort of a consistent area where the Alberta government's been spending time and money and building relationships and trying to get U.S. investment into the oil sands. For a long time, there was lots of lobbying about the Keystone XL pipeline. So it's come to fruition in some ways. I think there are relationships being built and things like that. In other ways, it's been less successful. Of course, Joe Biden scrapped the Keystone XL pipeline permits on his first day in office. And so one of the things that I thought was really interesting about this trip was that Smith was, of course, asked about the U.S. election, which is happening in November of this year. And she said, look, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden who's reelected, there's going to be some problems for Alberta and for Canada as a whole because of those protectionist stances. Of course, Canada's largest trading partner is the United States, and a lot of Alberta's energy exports go to the United States along with other products. So it's a really interesting time, I think, federally between the two governments in Ottawa and in Washington and whoever is the president in a year's time, but also, provincial politicians, whether that's, Doug Ford in Ontario, big auto manufacturer, things like that, or Alberta, big energy exporter. The U.S. political scene, I think, is one that everyone's going to be watching both inside and outside of politics quite closely for the next several months.
Now, the Alberta government's moratorium on green energy development ends at the end of the month, Tyler. It was a controversial proposal that officials said was meant to give the government time to create rules around things like land reclamation. Now, of concern for the province is the possible use of farmland. Where do we stand with that right now?
Well, the moratorium comes to an end, I think, on February 29th. And so this didn't impede projects that were already approved, projects that were already under construction, things like that. But it did sort of pause the approvals of new projects. And as you said, the argument being that there just weren't, structures set up around this, around like reclamation and land use and environmental impacts, things like that. So that's what sort of this year-long pause was meant to figure out. And it's now coming to an end, and there will be guidelines that are coming out towards the end of the month around green energy investment in the province. The thing that will sort of remain on the radar that's probably of sort of most interest to Albertans is that Danielle Smith said pretty clearly last week that they were not going to allow this development on prime agricultural land. So, you're not going to, they don't, I think the word she used was sterilize prime agricultural land. So they would be looking at projects, can you still have agricultural land around a windmill? Can cattle be grazing around a windmill? Those sorts of things are going to be part of the development considerations going forward. And this has been, I think, pretty hotly anticipated because Alberta is very much the destination for renewable energy development in the country. It's sort of well outpacing everybody else. And so that's part of the reason why there was so much shock and concern when this moratorium was announced. This is a booming industry in some ways, and why is the government putting the brakes on it? So presumably once the moratorium lifts, once the new rules are in place, things will take back off again.
Tyler, it appears as though three people have now thrown their hats to the ring to become the new leader of the Alberta NDP. Calgary MLA Kathleen Ganley and Edmonton MLA Sarah Hoffman and Raki Pancholi. Now, of the three, you say Pancholi made some of the biggest waves recently. Why is that?
Well, so she went on a sort of Edmonton talk radio podcast show, and one of the things that she talked about was the carbon tax. And she said, look, there isn't public support for the carbon tax. There's never been public support in Alberta for a consumer carbon tax. And it's maybe about time that we start thinking about other ways to tackle climate change. And so that was obviously kind of shocking because the NDP, the Alberta NDP, was the government in Alberta that brought in a carbon tax in 2015. It was then repealed by Kenney's government in 2019, and now it's a federal carbon tax that's in place here. But it was just kind of shocking because generally the defenders of the carbon tax are on the left or the progressive side of the spectrum, and it's conservative politicians who've said, people really don't like this, maybe we should get rid of it. So it was just a bit of a change of tone, shall we say, from a progressive politician. Now, Pancholi was not actually a part of the Notley government between 2015 and 2019. She came into politics after that, so maybe she gets a bit of a pass on not being affiliated with the Notley carbon tax when it was announced. And the funny thing about it is, so she said that, and then Hoffman and Ganley both kind of followed her and said, well, actually, yeah, the support for the carbon tax might be gone. It might be a dead policy. The Liberals have, one of the things Pancholi said was she pointed to the Liberals' changes in the carbon tax in the Maritimes, taking it off of home heating fuels, which was obviously really controversial. And so a bit of a funny position here where we have Raki Pancholi and Danielle Smith, to some extent, making the exact same argument around the carbon tax.
Yeah, home heating is for oil, but we'd love to see it come off of natural gas as well, especially for us here in the West. Now, Tyler, part of Kathleen Ganley's platform is that she has made a pitch on affordability. She said that the carbon tax as well is a federal issue, but that Albertans should receive an income tax exemption. How much?
Well, it would be about $4,000 or $5,000. So, Alberta has, until you make about $21,000 a year, that money is already exempted from the provincial income tax. So, regardless of whether you make $30,000 or $130,000, that first $21,500 or so is tax-free in Alberta. And so what Ganley was proposing was to actually just bump up that limit. Now, it does come up most years as a result of it's indexed to inflation often, although there was a controversy a couple years ago, I believe, where it was de-indexed from inflation. But at any rate, if that number, goes up, that means a couple $1,000s tax-free in Alberta. And so that would obviously save people a little bit of money. The numbers are not spectacularly humongous generally when we're looking at those sorts of things, but it would be something. Who knows, maybe it would be comparable to what Albertans end up paying in the carbon tax each year. So I think, not only does this say something about the carbon tax and maybe where the political consensus is moving on it, but it also says a fair bit about what I think is going to be one of the big issues in this race, and that's affordability. The NDP are in sort of a good position to talk about affordability because they're not in government. It's very hard to defend your record on affordability, I think, when you're in government. We see that with the federal Liberals. We're seeing that with provincial governments right across the country. So it's a good tack for them to really to go after the UCP, I think. And I would imagine that we're going to see a lot of that from the leadership candidates. I imagine we're going to see a lot of that from the NDP as a whole. And it'll be interesting to see how each of the candidates tries to differentiate themselves, what policies they're going to propose to sort of tackle some of that. And Ganley looks like she's one of the first out of the gate with a concrete proposal to get some more money into Albertans' pockets.
Now, Tyler, there's some word as well coming out of Calgary that former Calgary Mayor Naheed Nenshi is also considering entering the race to become the new leader of the Alberta NDP. He's currently exploring the possibility. What are you hearing?
Yeah, he's been pretty quiet. I've reached out to him a couple times and been like, "Hey, do you want to tell me what you're planning on doing here?" But no, he's been relatively quiet, I would say, in terms of confirming or denying what he's going to do. Although he has been out in public a little bit. He spoke at a big rally a week or so ago regarding Danielle Smith's transgender policies. Obviously, he opposes them. And gave quite a rousing speech to the protesters outside City Hall. So, he's sort of around, right? Like, he's been in the public sphere. He's been writing a little bit, doing media interviews a little bit, criticizing Danielle Smith, those sorts of things. So he's circling the political arena regardless of what he decides to do. If he decides to run for leader of the NDP, though, I think it'll be a fairly cataclysmic event. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that Nenshi is not, a super left-wing guy. His color, he always says, is purple, a mix of orange and blue. And so that's been one of the discussions about the Alberta NDP is, do they need to move more to the center to win? Do they need to move further to the left to have, really differentiated policies from the UCP? So I think it'll cause a little bit of internal friction in the New Democrats if he enters the race and starts proposing moving a little bit more to the center. The other thing that would be really interesting if he does that is he's known Danielle Smith for a very, very long time. They went to university together. They were in the same classes together. I believe Stephen Harper was actually one of their TAs when they were at the University of Calgary together. So he has a really, really long history with Smith, and in that sense knows her quite well. And he's a relatively savvy politician, and he's really well known. He's a household name, I think, almost everywhere in Alberta probably, which is not to criticize the other candidates, but not necessarily the case for Sarah Hoffman or Kathleen Ganley or Raki Pancholi or some of the other folks that people are talking about.
Now, there are reports that the provincial New Democrats are really not impressed with the federal New Democrats, in particular Ontario NDP Charlie Angus. Tyler, can you explain why that is?
Yeah. So Charlie Angus proposed legislation that would basically ban or criminalize the advertisement of fossil fuels. He says that this is having environmental impacts, having health impacts. Just like big tobacco can't advertise cigarettes, perhaps fossil fuel companies should not be able to advertise their products. Unsurprisingly, this has been rather controversial. Premier Danielle Smith saying it's an insane idea, is not in favor of it, and that more or less is echoed by the Saskatchewan and Alberta New Democrats, who said, "Look, this creates great jobs for people, creates a lot of money that comes into the provincial coffers. We've high environmental standards in Alberta's oil and gas sector, that sort of thing." So one of the things about the NDP is that it's not like the federal Liberals or the Conservatives. When you become a member of the Alberta NDP or the Saskatchewan NDP, you also become a member of the federal NDP. So there is this relationship that exists provincially to nationally in a way that isn't the case everywhere. It is in some provinces for members of the Liberal Party, the Alberta Liberals or the federal Liberals or whatever. So it's been a bit of a discussion for a while whether or not these provincial New Democrat parties should sort of divorce themselves from the federal NDP in some fashion. We talked, I think, a month or two ago about a possible name change for the Alberta New Democrats. So, is this going to totally fracture the provincial federal relationship between the parties? Maybe, maybe not. But it is an example of where there's some pretty serious policy disagreements, I think. And that's the case for pipelines. Rachel Notley has not been particularly friendly towards Jagmeet Singh, for example. But still a fun story, and it's always good to have some cross-jurisdictional conflict when you're in the news business.
A new leader, maybe a new name for the party as well, create that separation, like you said, from the federal NDP. Now, Tyler, with increased immigration and a growing population in our province, many of our social services are being stretched thin, from education to healthcare and housing. And the Alberta Medical Association is saying there's a real risk that our growing population is going to make the healthcare situation even worse, and it'll be harder and harder for people to find a family physician.
Yeah, and it makes sense as sort of a matter of common sense, right? Like if you have X amount of doctors and you have, double or triple the number of people coming in, obviously doctors are going to have to take on more and more and more and more patients, or people are going to be going without family physicians. So that's one of the things that they've flagged. They said, look, we have this in-migration to Alberta each year, huge numbers of people, tens of thousands of people, I believe, and we're not having sort of proportionate numbers of healthcare professionals coming into the province. So maybe there's political reasons for that. Maybe there's policy the government could introduce or something like that would make Alberta a more attractive destination for physicians. But at the end of the day, when people are already struggling to find primary care providers, it certainly suggests that if population continues to grow, whether from immigration or interprovincial migration, that it is going to sort of strain an already strained healthcare system.
Firefighting groups, along with the Alberta NDP, are calling on the UCP to release its wildfire plan. Tyler, it was a record-breaking wildfire season last year, and the government said it's been working on policy?
Yeah, so last year was like an incredibly bad wildfire season, if anyone has forgotten. And I think it was about 2.2 million hectares burned last year. And actually, some of those fires are still burning over the winter, sort of under the snow or in brush and things like that. So there's a real concern that the wildfire season coming up, which begins in a month or two, I think, technically speaking, is going to be another really, really bad one. And so the government has been working on its plan for tackling this, and municipalities and the NDP and firefighting organizations are saying, we haven't seen the plan. Wildfire season is like 6 or 8 weeks away. Can we see the plan? So the NDP has been raising a little bit of trouble about that the last little while. I don't think it's a massive political story. I don't think it's a massive issue that has really got people worked up, but certainly something to think about because wildfires affect all of us, and people are no doubt curious what the plans are for this year.
Yeah, I got a plan. Pray for more rain and more snow. We need a lot more moisture right now.
It's as good as any, isn't it?
Yeah. He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.